Hello? All right. So let's start. Thank you for joining us. My studio and I are very happy to have you here tonight. We at the University of Southern California, Dornsife, who collaborate with us in this project. We're very grateful to them for supporting this. And we're especially happy to have Elizabeth here tonight. The lecture project is a series of lectures. We usually do 3 or 4 a year, where we bring historians, philosophers, curators, to talk about a topic related to art and ethics. That's the idea. It's slightly different than what you might see at a gallery or a museum. And we're very, very excited today. My first encounter with Elizabeth's work was in Berlin in 1997. My first trip to Berlin, I went to the Cato Covitz Museum and bought this book. That same night, I read her essay, and I have been a fan ever since. And her work on the work of Lane Munch, the Lane Munch paintings, is always in that painting table there, never too far. So Elizabeth is noted for being a distinguished art historian and the author of many books, and she's the Kaiser Family Professor of Art History at Georgetown University. She has written about many artists, including, among those, 4 of my favorites, Munch, Covitz, Homer, and Ekins. She has also curated and co-created a number of exhibitions of prints of the Nabi, Munch, Covitz, and most recently Gauguin, producing substantial catalogs and articles about them. Her talk today will be about Munch's legacy, how Munch's legacy was shaped and co-opted during the Nazi rule. So it is with great pleasure, personal pleasure, and we're so excited that she's here. And let me say before we move on, that we could not have brought her here without the support of my studio, Diana, Pablo, Ivan, Gabriel, Chris, and Nick, who without them, we couldn't do anything. Certainly, I couldn't do anything. So thank you. Elizabeth, please join us.
Thank you, Enrique. So thank you all for coming tonight. I'm so pleased, and it's so exciting to be here, and I wanted to thank Enrique above all for inviting me, and he's already listed the names of all the people I wanted to thank too, but I especially want to thank Diana Clark, without whose help there would be a pickle. So yeah, let me start and orient you to talking about Munch. We are accustomed to an artist and his or her work being subject to the tyranny of this critical artistic industry. However, in some cases, we know they're actually hijacked. Their reputations are hijacked by hostile forces. That can be for a number of reasons, and the artist exploited. And it's precisely this kind of idea that I wanted to explore this evening. Enrique has given me the idea that this would be a good episode in the ideas of the lecture project. So that is how we will proceed. Let me make sure. All right. I wanted to introduce my case in point, and that is Edvard Munch, the Norwegian artist. he was so controversial, and his work was so controversial right from the very beginning of his career, that the issue of his reputation and how it was controlled, how he shaped it, and how it was co-opted is really something that happens very early on in the 1890s. And as you can see, he lived a very long life. People aren't always aware, actually, that he lived well into the 20th century. That's not so known. 1893, the scream, that's it. But we know that's not true. And one of the things that I was so delighted about was that Enrique loves this later period, and so do I. So here we have Munch as the quintessential bohemian artist with a cigarette shown in this very smoky kind of indeterminate background. And these are the pictures that you may well know. Munch was early on best known for his subject matter, subjects like love, death, anxiety, jealousy, and those are the subjects and the way he painted them that the audiences found to be truly shocking. We of course see many things in them. This is the only painting I didn't identify because I thought if you need a label on that, that will be a problem. But he was someone who really was tuned into the anxiety of the modern world. And I think this is one of the best examples. Evening on the Karl Johan, which is like the Champs-Élysées of Oslo, all right, where you see all those ghostly figures moving toward you. And then, as scholars know, that's probably Munch himself headed in the opposite direction from the crowd. You also have images like Madonna, all right, which shocked a lot of people, this nude figure leaning back in a kind of strange ecstasy. But to call her Madonna seems to be very oxymoronic. And that title as well had a lot of negative impact when these works were shown in Berlin in 1892. In fact, he had a big show in Berlin, and it was viewed as so shocking that it was shut down, to great protests on the part of avant-garde collectors and artists. And of course, when you have a succès de scandale like that, it really made his fame, at least. Anything that was subject to such negative criticism was obviously going to be a hit. We all know how that works. So, yeah, so he was a very peripatetic artist. He traveled practically ceaselessly, having exhibitions everywhere and traveling throughout Europe. He had many friends and in many locations, and he was drinking so much alcohol and overdoing it and smoking and hanging out with friends in bohemian environments. And ultimately, that combined with a very, very complex and heartbreaking childhood. He was 5 when his mother died, and that, of course, made an everlasting impression on him. He had a sister who died at the age of 15, his favorite one. It was perhaps inevitable that this would lead to a breakdown. And indeed, he had a breakdown in 1908, 1909. He went to a Danish clinic in Copenhagen. And what's interesting is that he really was cured in a way. His whole very sort of taciturn Norwegian personality lightened up. And you can see that, I think, in this comparison, where you have the self-portrait in hell from 1895, or I think it's 1903, actually. But imagine if you were doing a self-portrait, how would you want to show yourself? Think about it. Probably not in hell. It wouldn't be my first choice. But then he keeps painting while he's in the clinic. He had a fantastic doctor. And when you look at this picture from 1909, you can already see that it's taking on a freshness of color and a kind of staccato handling that is much more due to sort of French modernism than it was to this earlier symbolist kind of painting. So there he is, he's shown himself by a window, his expression is quite optimistic. So there he is, and I think that really shows a big change. Now, as he goes back to Norway to really settle in his homeland, he buys this great estate. How does he do that? He's actually made a fair amount of money. His work is very popular, very saleable, okay, particularly among very advanced German collectors, all right? He is very at home in Berlin in particular. But yeah, he's also done very well in Norway after having been reviled there for being much too bohemian. So he bought this big estate, he had the money, and what's funny is that the Norwegians are very modest people, and the newspapers ridiculed him for having so many rooms. You know, it just seemed a little unseemly, but it became, I don't know, I don't even dare compare it to this magnificent studio, but it became where he lived, where he worked, both inside and outside, by the way. And here you see him painting away in his outdoor studio, which is a whole story in itself, and there he was at home. Now, Munch started becoming very, very interested in brighter colors, looser brushwork, as I showed you with that comparison of the two portraits, all right? And this new direction in his art was definitely inflected by his interest in the French master Henri Matisse, all right? And I'm showing you one of, here it is, Matisse's major statement paintings from 1907, the Blue Nude. I just was putting some nudes together. There's a later one that Munch did, but what is even more important is that there was a group of Norwegian artists who went to Paris to study with Matisse, all right? And there was a whole Norwegian expat community in Paris, but when World War I started, they had to come home, all right? So they brought all of this new freshness home with them, and Munch was deeply influenced, as he was, by German modernism as well, such as the German expressionists. And I'll show you more pictures of this. But when one talks about Munch's influence on other painters, one also has to be aware that it's reciprocal. Munch also, despite being older than the other ones, was also influenced. So it was a real back and forth, a very interesting dynamic. And I wanted to pull out as well just one image by one of the Norwegian Matisse students, Ludvig Karsten, there, and I'm showing you his standing nude from 1910, and the activated, spontaneous seeming brushwork of it, the looseness and the immediacy of it very much reflects Matisse's influence. It's interesting because, you know, Munch knew Karsten, and there's a wonderful anecdote about how they both were getting totally drunk one night and it ended up in a knockdown, drag-out fight. I think the police may have been called in, but Munch ultimately made an etching of that little encounter. Okay, now, during the war, Munch also turned to landscape painting more than he had before. And what's interesting here is that it was not just his moving away from those kinds of heavily psychological symbolist paintings that he had been making earlier on, but it also was an interest in referring to his homeland during a time when war was being waged down south in Europe. So he raises the landscape. I'm showing you the cabbage field. It's one of my favorites. And then a picture of winter on the fjord. It was a way of really actually being a little bit nationalistic. And what's interesting as well is that he uses a style here that is more related to Matisse and French modernism than it is to German art or Norwegian art. And of course, there's a lot of anti-German feeling during the war. So in turning to a more French style, he's also making, in a way, a political statement. Okay? And when we have that freshness of vision, I mean, Enrique, that pleased me so much when you were talking about that phenomenon of the handling of paint and the movement of the strokes and the seeming, again, spontaneity of all of this, to say nothing of those stunning colors. It really is very special. And I wanted to show you as well that this kind of interest in the landscape and trees and fruit that were actually on his property, okay, at his estate, which I mentioned was called Ekkeli. It has something to do with the word oak, because there were a lot of oak trees on the property. And there you can see the big house up on the hill with these apple trees heavily laden with fruit. He is, I'll tell you more about this later, but the idea of the blue trunk, for example, that kind of surrender to a fresh idea of expression as opposed to description, straight up description, is one of the things that makes these paintings exciting right up to the 40s. So in Norway, excuse me, let me go back for a second. He realizes that art commerce could not continue with the war on. So he avoided showing the symbolist pictures exhibiting the symbolist pictures that I just showed you, and exhibited for sale the works of landscapes, for example. Let me just go back for 1 second. These, of course, are very late ones, but they were celebratory. And what's interesting is that as he sought to get shows in galleries, in Norwegian galleries, Oslo galleries, Blomkvist in particular, he got very good reviews The public and the critics really liked these paintings. They were called fresh and vigorous, and the pictures sold. Now, let's go to 1933, and let's go to Germany. This is when the Nazis took power. It is also in Berlin. We're talking about the Nazis in Munich, but in Berlin, Munch had found his first serious fame and first serious collectors, and that's where he had started making money. Now, for the Nazis, culture was immensely important as a kind of way of controlling, of thought control, all right, and control of society. And they began really in 1933 to try to control what was exhibited to the public, what could be even owned by museums, what could be exhibited, and also, ultimately, not quite this early, what artists were allowed to create, and if they were even allowed to make work. Okay, so it's an extraordinary kind of idea. Now, the avant-garde art of the first decades of the 20th century included all sorts of movements: expressionism, abstraction, Bauhaus architecture and design, Dadaism. It was one of the most productive periods ever, and it flourished under the first republic, the democratic republic that Germany had ever had. It just let loose this flood of creativity, all right? The Kaiser abdicated, and 1909, you have a whole new government, and then, of course, the Nazis take it over in 1933. And one of the things that bothers them so much is the idea of freedom of expression, freedom of exploration, which of course is the language of the avant-garde and a free society, as we all know. And I wanted to show you this picture of the Bauhaus, the building house, which was, this is in its iteration in Dessau, which until recently was in East Germany, of course. And this was the avant-garde school of art, design, architecture. It was the symbol of modernism. When you look at the straight or angular lines of this building, its asymmetry with the entrance over here on the side of the building, and then it's got its sign there in big sans serif font, to identify it, Bauhaus. So that really was a symbol of modernism. Now, April 11th, 1933, the architect Mies van der Rohe, who's head of the school at that point, he shows up. The whole school is shut down, cordoned off by the police. They've shut it down as being a kind of Bolshevist, communist kind of building. And that, of course, unleashes a whole new story that's not our subject for tonight. But this kind of anti-freedom of expression and anti-modernism was seen, and I'm looking forward a little bit here to 1937, but the slide is relevant to the idea, which is that not only was art, Kunst, considered degenerate and autete, okay, but so was music. The Nazis banned all kinds of avant-garde music. And their biggest enemy, jazz. That was American, it was atonal, and the people who played it tended to be black, okay, a black jazz band. You'll notice that on this poster for Degenerate music, they've put a Jewish star on the saxophone player, okay? So we have a lot of different codes that are operating here. Now, what did they promote? Let's look for a second. They promoted things like this. They promoted heroic kinds of scenes, you know, the happy peasants. There are no hungry, dying, potato-eating peasants here, but there are these glorious women here who are playing the accordion, they're coming back from the fields. You'll notice not one of them looks tired. I mean, you can imagine, but no, they're all extremely cheerful and hearty and beautiful. So we also have, interestingly, the Nazis loved pornographic nudes, or semi-pornographic ones. And if you'll notice, Adolf Ziegler, in this triptych called The Four Elements, you've got fire, water, earth, and air, okay? They're all these, they're supposed to be classical figures, but they really, in reality, look kind of like fashion plates undressed from the 1930s, which is exactly what they are, okay? And that actually was Hitler's favorite painting. And what I'm showing you down here, I hope you can see it, Selena, down over here, is that painting hung over the fireplace in Hitler's office in the Reich's chancellery, all right? So what do you want to look at? Well, he wanted to look at that. So this is what is interesting, is that the regime wanted to sponsor art that was easily readable, that was not elitist. You know how people fear things that they can't understand, and they think that, you know, art people are going around like this, and oh, I see this. That was a threat. And the Nazis wanted the general populace not to come into contact with that sort of thing, and I'll tell you more about that. So, as a strategy then, the Nazis wanted to clean the temple of art, okay, and get rid of what they called degenerate, okay? Degenerate, entartet. That's a pretty heavy-duty word, all right. Now, the concept of degeneracy already had a history, and I'm showing you Max Nordau here, Hungarian physician, who wrote a book called Degeneration. I am actually showing you an English translation of the book. This was 1892, but I thought that the binding was so beautiful. The font is so, you know, fin de siècle, and you've got that sort of genie in a, you know, what do you call it, in a bottle, I suppose. So this was interesting because what he did was to support and help to legitimize these racial theories that had been around for ages, but which took on a particular importance during this period, okay? And this is from a book by Dr. Günther called Race and Style, where he argued that a work of art is determined by the race of its creator, all right? And more than that, that modernist art actually was reflecting people with disabilities and deformities. Therefore, art, sorry, go ahead.
Degenerate.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And therefore, you have pictures by Schmidt-Rottluff and Haeckel, and you'll recognize the Modigliani there, okay? Which our friend Dr. Günther juxtaposed with each other in order to denigrate the modern art. And that is pretty scary, okay? Now, let's see. The criteria for modernism were actually applied very inconsistently, all right? There were all sorts of criticisms that were launched at modern art: Bolshevist, Marxist, insane, Jewish, corrupt, un-German, international, all code words, okay? And what is interesting is that even an artist, if you think of an artist's work being equivalent to his or her politics, even a great work of art by someone who was a member of the Nazi Party, and an enthusiastic one, Emil Nolde, his work, which you can see, here's his huge Life of Christ. I'm showing you that version so you can see how enormous it is. It was confiscated and shown in the big, from the museum it was in, and shown in the big Degenerate art exhibition that I'm going to talk with you about. Nolde was absolutely, he was in despair, and he was completely incredulous. And he actually wrote to Goebbels and said, "What is going on? My art is from the blood and soil of Germany, and you're treating it like a piece of degenerate junk." So he got a very unfortunate lesson there. And when I'll skip ahead to this just for a second. When there was the Nazis put together, in 1937, I see nods, so some of you know well about this. In 1937, a lot of these works of great German art were shown with signs on them talking satirically about, is this an expression of German religiosity? There were also things that were a lot more negative. Now, of all the artists who were subject to this slur of degenerate, interestingly, Munch was probably the least obvious choice. He wasn't Jewish, he wasn't a Bolshevist, he was not a Marxist, but his work was modern. And that posed a problem for the Nazis, because at the same time, he was also considered one of the most famous and most important artists of the period. Now, this had already been, proven, so to speak, when a great tribute had been paid to him, when in an exhibition in 1912 in Cologne, he was given a whole gallery to exhibit his work, along with Van Gogh, along with Gauguin. That's pretty heady company. And here I'm showing you a slide from that show. There's the Madonna, there's his sister Inger on the beach. Here are some snow shovelers. There are the three girls on the bridge. There is the sick child. These are all major, major pictures. So he was fully recognized, he was 48 at that time, as being extremely important. And I wanted to say as well that even in the 1936, okay, that's pretty late in the game, an acquisition of a painting by Munch, and there is his spring plowing there, was still made the newspapers. This is a newspaper from Essen, from the famous Folkwang Museum. That is a collection that was absolutely robbed blind by the Nazis, okay? And they still haven't gotten back a lot of the pictures that were confiscated from their collection. But look, here are all the luminaries of the day. The director of the museum is showing off the Munch picture, Edvard Munch. So they're showing, even then, an acquisition could make the papers. Now what's important is that this painting was one of the ones that was confiscated. When the Nazis were rounding up modern art, okay, from the museums, they said they wanted to get rid of it, to burn it. It's not clear that works of art were ever burned. We know books were burned, but it's not quite clear. But so I want you to look there at the provenance of this painting, where it was owned by a private collector, Max Glaser, and then it went through different places. There is the Museum Folkwang Essen, 1936, from that newspaper that I just showed you, okay? And then it was confiscated a year later, and it went to the NS's, the National Socialist Depot, where all the works of art that had been confiscated were gathered. And then somehow it got in the hands of Harold Holst Halvorsen, who was a Norwegian dealer. We'll talk just for a minute about him later. Then the picture was bought by a Norwegian private person. Then it was put up for sale at Sotheby's, and it's now in a private collection in America, a painting that had been in Essen. So what I wanted to add to that, okay, is that, and this, yeah, I kept trying to think where I should fit this into my lecture, but since it's right here, I will tell you about it now. For scholars who are interested in the work that was confiscated by the Nazis, and we often don't know where it went, a new database, well, it was launched in 2010, has been established at the Free University in Berlin, and it is called the Inventory of Confiscated Art, Degenerate Art. And they have been doing tons of research. And for each work, you'll see there's a thumbnail right here. They have all the information that they can find on these works, many of which have disappeared. And you can see location now, USA, from Trust, all right? So this inventory is very important for people doing scholarship. How am I doing for time? Okay. There was just so much I wanted to tell you. Okay, let me go on to this. Okay, now, Goebbels was a huge fan of Munch, okay? He had to be careful about it because the Nazis that was not okay. So, on the occasion of the artist's 70th birthday, so this is December 12th, 1933, okay? Goebbels sends Munch a letter, okay, and I'm going to read it to you. I greet you as the greatest painter of the Germanic world. And he goes on, referring to Munch in the third person, very respectful. Sprouted from Nordic, Teutonic soil, his works speak to me of life's profound seriousness. His paintings, landscapes as well as representations of human beings, are suffused by deep passion. Munch struggles to comprehend nature and its truth and to capture it in the picture. uncompromisingly scorning all academic formality, a powerful, independent, strong-willed spirit, heir of Nordic culture. He frees himself of all naturalism and reaches back to the eternal foundations of national art creating, Völkischen art creating. Whoa, okay? Now, what's interesting about this is that actually it's extraordinarily insightful. I mean, that's a really good description of what Munch was doing. It's just that it was tricky because that very same year in 1933 was when the Nazis started sending around, excuse me one second here. Yeah, they were sending around sort of small exhibitions around the country in Germany. And these were exhibitions that were full of, they were sort of like mini degenerate art exhibitions. They would put together a small number of these modernist pictures, which were scorned by them, and they'd send them around. And they called them Schreckenskammer, chambers of art, of horror, okay, Schrecken. So chamber of horrors, they also called these things abomination art. And you know, when you look around here, oh, by the way, here's Hitler enjoying the, you know, these are actually a bunch of Berlin realists, some abstract things, a work by Otto Dix, or is it Gross, over here. So all things that they felt attacked Germany in some way or were stylistically unacceptable. Now what's interesting is that these Schreckenskammer exhibitions had implications for Munch. Why? Because some of his works appeared in those shows, which is remarkable because ultimately his work did not appear in the big show in 1937. So one wonders why. But anyway, they were busy sending around these exhibitions. Hold on one second here. And also going to museums in order to, the Nazis, going to museums in order to pillage them of works of modern art. And you hear these stories of when they showed up, for example, at print cabinets at various museums, and curators are hiding the prints. Have you heard that story, Leslie? Yeah, you know, so that the pillaging German hordes won't find them and rob the collections of these great works of art, all right? So now we get more having a programmatic manifesto against modern art. It's a program. And it included such statements as all works of a cosmopolitan or Bolshevist nature should be removed from German museums and collections, but first they should be exhibited to the public, who should be informed of the details of their acquisition and then burned. Art that insults German feeling or destroys or confuses natural form or simply reveals an absence of adequate manual artistic skill. And you know, that's what is so easy to say when there's something that is semi-abstract. It's that they don't know how to draw, or their kid could do that, all right? Now, one of the things is, and I wanted to show you this, is that one of these actions taken by the Nazis was to strip important modernist living artists of their positions at academies like the Prussian Academy of Art, for example. One of them was Cato Covitz, who was either the first or second female professor at the Prussian Academy of Fine Arts. And they summarily fired her, and she went into what she called a kind of internal exile. Technically, she was forbidden to work. She was certainly forbidden to teach, but she is one of those figures who was so famous and so beloved by the public that they really couldn't touch her. She talks about being visited by the Gestapo one day, but nothing came of it. And I also wanted to show you the example of Otto Dix, also an important teacher and someone who, had been very pro-World War I. I'm showing you this great self-portrait. And then up here, his famous picture of war cripples, which had been in Dresden. It was also seized, okay? And one more, I wanted to show you Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who was one of the great German expressionists. That's one of my favorite pictures. It's at MoMA, and it shows these prostitutes on a Berlin street in this very jagged, immediate kind of style. Kirchner had 600 of his works removed from German museums. He committed suicide in 1938. It was just too much. All right, now, this is what happened. The Nazi sort of culture crew was given 10 days to confiscate from 32 German museums thousands of works that they deemed degenerate, though they differed so much that it was impossible to know what was going on. No clear directives. This included 82 works by Munch from museums in, and I'm reading this, Lübeck, Mannheim, Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, Hanover, Düsseldorf, Bremen, Ulm, Heidelberg, Bielefeld, Kiel, Munich, Cologne, and Frankfurt. Can you imagine? Okay, but only 82. Kirchner had 600. But so here we have important painters gone from their academic positions, replaced by museum directors were replaced by Nazi directors, Nazi appointees who followed the party line. So here we have, on July 19th of 1937, the opening of the Great Degenerate Art Exhibition. And I am showing you the cover of the catalog. The previous day, the so-called Great German Art Exhibition opened in a brand new building that Hitler had commissioned. And I think the comparison speaks for itself. They chose for the cover of the Degenerate Art, in quotes, exhibition, what I have to admit is probably the ugliest expressionist sculpture ever created, but it's an expressive and poignant head that is full of power. So I think we have that sense of the kind of classical versus the modern. And again, I wanted to show you the kinds of things you could have seen if you went to the Great German Art Exhibition. You could have seen this portrait of Hitler, okay, as a knight in shining armor. You could have seen this brown shirt peasant family, okay? And you could have seen something like this, which is the Judgment of Paris, okay, where you have, Athena and Aphrodite and Diana, and there they are. Here is a nice young man from the Hitler Youth who is holding the apple. He gave it to Aphrodite. It started the Trojan War. And here are these figures. There's nothing classical about them, of course. Ziegler was called, forgive me, the master of the pubic hair, and he got every single one in his pictures. So that's the kind of thing that you would have seen. And what's interesting is that the Degenerate art show, where they showed things of the nature that I showed you, was the most visited exhibition. That's where everyone went. There was no one at the other one. And it traveled to 13 cities. I'm showing you the line to get in Hamburg, okay? It was just a mass of people. And then quickly you would see in there works from different movements, different periods. Here are the Nolde pictures. He did the Life of Christ triptych. Here is a sculpture by Kirchner, and then here is Dada, and they've got satirical quotes from the movement itself. There are labels that say how much the work cost, and they were meant to make people laugh at them and think, all those elitist people, look, they're finally getting their own. I'm showing you here a newspaper article from the Norwegian newspaper called Tidensting. You can see it right here, which means sort of signs of the time. It was a newspaper that ceased publication in 1941. And it has an article here where the head of the National Gallery in Berlin is reassuring the Norwegian public that there is no immediate danger that Munch should come under the term false art. Okay, they're worried. What's going on in Berlin? And they say, yes, Munch is still hanging. Hänger Fremdeles, he's still hanging. And then, of course, Heil Hitler, but Dr. Rave is saying to the Norwegians, he's, anti-Nazi, just relax. They are okay. So it's interesting. We don't quite know what was going on. Now, I want to show you, and I'm going to be very quick here, 3 examples of why this new confiscated art database is so important, all right? It has thumbnails of pictures that we can't find anymore, such as snow shovelers. It was removed from the National Gallery in Berlin. The artist himself had given it to them. They wanted it to be disposed of, and it was removed because it had international sales value. And the Nazis needed hard currency, not Reichsmarks, okay? So it was removed, put in storage, impounded, then returned, and then lost. And then here is another one of the 2 lonely ones, which again, I won't go through all of it, but when you look at these provenances, this, by the way, is why when you're buying a painting, always check and see where it was from about 1933 to 1945. Auction houses will often not take lots for if that period of time is unaccounted for, okay? So the same thing with this lonely ones, and the same thing with the sick child, which was in Dresden, and then went to this Norwegian dealer, Harald Holst Halvorsen, private collector, ended up at the Tate. So what's interesting is that these pictures were sold in Norway, okay? This dealer, Holst Halvorsen, went straight to the Nazis and purchased them back to sell in Norway. So Munch's pictures were taken care of better than a lot of the other artists, okay? And therefore, there were no Munch pictures that were auctioned off for hard currency in Lucerne, okay, in 1939. A lot of the great pictures, the Nazis wanted money for them. They didn't want to burn them. So at this auction, they sold off their patrimony. And I was reading about one of the women who worked at the gallery, Fischer, an Aryan gallery, and she wept as Germany's patrimony just went out the window. But I did want to point out that we're lucky in certain ways because the pictures were saved from destruction or disappearance. And I'm pointing out one of the works that was sold. I mean, look at this. It's so deliberately misleading here. It says paintings and sculpture of modern masters from German museums. You know, why would they deaccession this Van Gogh portrait? All right, but it's sold, and luckily it's sold to private collector Morris Wertheim, who bequeathed it to Harvard, and that's where it is today. Okay, now the Nazis, they occupied Oslo, all of Norway, in 1940. Munch was still at Ekeli, though he was terrified that his studio and his art were going to be confiscated. Moreover, the Nazis really co-opted him. This is where they tried to say that he was, and I read this to you on the part of Goebbels, that he was the original example, the Urbild, okay, of a Nordic artist. They're conflating Nordic and Teutonic, okay, and here is a visit to Edvard Munch, February 1937, there he is, and the Nazis paid tribute to his work in these exhibitions in Oslo. He wanted nothing to do with these, but the Germans, the occupying forces, and collaborators like Quisling, of course, held exhibitions, and he refused to take part in these, but they kept at it, and even his funeral, when he was gone, even his funeral was staged as a big Nazi ceremony, and the crematorium chapel was draped in swastikas. You know, he couldn't even escape that, and it was impossible for some people not to suspect that the artist had been a Nazi sympathizer, which of course was ridiculous. So my argument is that Munch ultimately exemplified for his enemies this Urbild of the Nordic artist, fulfilling this tendency in German thought, particularly with the arts, to conflate Nordic and Germanic ideals and to confront their own dilemmas about the question of what is German art. And what's interesting, of course, is that German art, real German art, was right in their face. Nolde, Kirchner, all the artists whose work was anathema to them. So these last years of Munch's life provide this particularly vivid illustration of how an individual can lose control of his reputation in the face of these powerful forces. And his reputation as this Urbild collided with the Nazis' own hostility, in principle, toward the style of his painting. So despite all the attempts on the part of the German occupying forces to have him collude in his own self-promotion and subjecting him to the fear of seizure of his home and store of art, Munch resisted. It was the honesty of his art and of his vision that prevailed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm really glad to take questions if there are things that I didn't cover properly or things you're interested in hearing about. Yes?
Have you seen the Richter bio film, Never Look Away?
No, tell me about it.
3 or 4 minute scene of Richter as a 7-year-old boy seeing the Degenerate art exhibition and being taken around with his schizophrenic aunt, looking at the art, and he likes the art, and yet the German officials lecturing about how terrible the art is. It's extraordinarily important to be
Thank you.
and seeing. I suggest you see that.
Thank you. I will see that. And it's called Don't Look.
Never look away.
Never Look Away. Thank you. Boy, that must have been a chilling experience. Had I had time, and I know I spoke for a while, I would have shown you this clip of people walking through the Degenerate art exhibition. And of course, it's a silent video, but you should see people sort of walking from one picture to the next. And, you know, it's just heartbreaking. There's no expression on their faces that's like, ha, ha, ha. No, it's just this, I know, this solemn look. So yes, thank you for that. Yeah. Anything else you can think of? Yes.
Like the actual art he's producing, did he make any public statement on his positions in terms of what was happening in Europe or anything like that?
You know, that is a great question. The answer is not really. What happened was more in terms of his actions, and he did make comments about these actions, which are, he basically let go his contacts with his many, many German friends and patrons, because it was, first of all, not possible to keep up with them during both wars, actually, you know, First and Second World War. But did he come out with an anti-Nazi statement? Only in the context of, no, I'm not going to participate in that exhibition. But I think it was really quite clear, and he broke off with the author. Was that me? With the author, it's thunder and hellfire, with the author and Nobel Prize winner Knut Hamsun, who tried to kind of suck him into the occupying forces side, but he didn't go there. Yeah, but you know what? I'm going to look more into it. That's a really good question. Anything else that? Yes.
So do you think that when he came from Berlin back to Norway, and he began to make the landscape, all those landscapes that you showed, that there was not an attempt in Munch's art to react to this sort of nationalistic landscape painting of Norway? So there was a strategic consideration of Munch on taking this subject matter.
I think it was strategic. And I think that's very important. I don't think that's everything, but I think that idea, and I think you and I have talked about this a little bit, which is that during the First World War and when all those expats came back to Norway, the prevailing style that was modern and also made a political statement was French. And he moved in that direction, but I think that his new lease on life also had something to do with that. Is that answer?
Well, the famous Norwegian paintings, or the popular Norwegian paintings of that time, a lot of them were landscape paintings. So it seems like his return and recognizing, from what I know, which is just a tiny bit, that seeing the popularity of some of the other landscape painters, or the subject matter that other people were taking in Norway, makes him sort of try to wedge himself into that dialogue partly to be liked. And what I think is quite interesting is usually as artists we think that any kind of conforming to something external is some sort of application of something valuable. But I think in Munch's case, he freed his work away from the heavy psychological stuff of the early work to make those incredible landscape paintings that come later. So it's not the typical story that one hears of an artist giving in to external pressures. It actually worked for him, I think, and I just would like to get your thoughts on that.
I think that's a very good point, and you're also having me realize that landscape was always important to Norwegian artists, to everyone, so that he was reaching back as well into a Norwegian iconographical tradition of landscape.
So I think am I still mic?
You're fine, yeah.
Okay, I think his embrace of that is related to all these things. It was strategic, but it also, he's reaching to French influences, and in the subject matter, he's also delving back into Norwegian 19th century landscape painting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, okay.
May I ask you a good question? So you talked about the property he was able to buy.
Yes.
Based on the sales of his work. So I was wondering where, clearly some ended up in Germany, where else, who was buying this work, and what was the kind of context or narrative around the work that was allowing that transmission to those sites or collectors? How was he being framed for an international audience? If that was who was in fact buying the work, or was it more local?
Well, he got his first fame and money in Berlin in the 1890s, okay? I mentioned that exhibition that was shut down and that really made him famous. But even in the decade or so before that, the director of the National Gallery in Oslo had bought one or two of his pictures. A couple had been sold, but it was really collectors in Berlin. And by the way, I might add that Munch was one of the great printmakers, obviously. I didn't mention that. But so he sold lots and lots of prints as well. But so there were tons of well-to-do sort of upper middle class Germans with whom he became friends. One of them, a judge from Hamburg, was the first person to make a catalog of all his prints. Then when he went back to Norway, he already had a solid following. And he sold to all sorts of people there. And there was that local gallery, Lone Fist, that sold a lot of his work. So it was shown in America at the Carnegie Museum in 1912, maybe. And also, if I remember correctly, he had a work in the Armory Show in 1913 in the US. So, plus a lot of international press. Yeah.
Do you have any more information about that minister of propaganda and whether he had an active role in how the Nazis felt, or was that just the
Well, golly, yeah. I guess my answer to that is where to begin. Okay? One thing that I realized I didn't mention was that the Norwegians were very worried that works by Munch would be shown in the big 1937 exhibition. It's not clear whether or not some of them were shown in a room sort of upstairs, but the Norwegian consul intervened and said, this just is not okay, and he did not appear. Goebbels was in a tricky position because Munch was included in that group, but as I say, he had a kind of special status. And that was part of the cognitive dissonance. You know, he was the Ur-built, but he was modern. What to do? Yeah, it's a good question. Should I take one more?
One more question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Were Germans buying his art, let's say, in 39 or 41?
There was that one, you saw that museum acquisition in Essen, so that was 1936. I don't know of others during that period, but it was a pretty bold acquisition when you consider the date. And I think that's the best I can do with that question. But it is an important one.
Thank you very
So
much.
thank you so much.